Westminster on Wales and Northern Ireland. Juliet Davenport is founder of GoodEnergy. Seb Payne has a lot of energy, but he's also FT Whitehall editor. And Samantha Smith is a Conservative activist. So they're here for the next hour answering your questions. The number to call 0345 6060 973.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Welcome to you all. And let me actually also remind you that you can, of course, if you miss an edition of Cross Question, there's the Cross Question podcast, which you can download on Global Player or wherever you get your podcast from. And every edition is on the LBC YouTube channel as well. David in Enfield is our first caller. David, hi. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Is it time to abolish the House of Lords, given recent revelations that 22 of the Tories' biggest donors over the past 11 years have received peerages?
Big issue of the day, this. Seb Payne.
Yes, is my thought on this, that the House of Lords isn't reformed at the moment because nobody can really get up the gumption to do it, not because there's a good reason for it to continue to exist. And during the travels I've done around England over the past couple of years, it's the one thing people always cite as being indefensible. It doesn't make sense. My solution would be to have a chamber of partial legislative experts who could do the scrutiny of bills, combined with representatives of the devolved parliaments and the mayors across England. So it's a way of binding together the union, trying to repair England's social contract and get rid of something that I don't think anyone thinks really has a reason to exist anymore.
The Blair government tried to reform it, didn't they? But was it? I think they came up with 5 different solutions, and MPs voted down every single one of them. And all they did was abolish most of the hereditary peers, but there are still 92 of them in the House of Lords.
That's right, and they're still there, and some of them go there because of someone from Aquitaine or William the Conqueror, or long-standing traditions into English history, which some say is quite nice, quite arcane, but it's not really fit for modern representative democracy anymore. And I think the idea of reforming it to get rid of the hereditary peers, that ship has now gone. I think you need something much bigger and much more fundamental, because if you look at the political events the past 5 years, people do want change. They do feel they're not being represented well, and the House of Lords is an obvious target to repair that.
Do you believe that money is effectively exchanging hands to become a Conservative peer? If you donate a certain amount, that will get you a peerage?
Well, if you look at the Sunday Times front page, and I think it's 13 out of those 14 Conservative Party treasurers have gone to the House of Lords, and I think one of them was Lord Farmer, who said that there was a sort of an agreement that this is the sort of thing that happens here. Obviously, when you look at who goes to the House of Lords, yes, they're businessmen who are very successful and done a lot of money for charity and for the economy, but there is a clear link between what they do for their political parties. But it's the same for the Labour Party as well. Their General Secretary.
Exactly. I can think of a couple of their treasurers that are in there. In fact, I can think of 3 off the top of my head.
And the General Secretaries of the Labour Party. So this is not just the Conservatives, across all politics. They have representatives there who have a financial or steering interest, and that's yet another reason why it should go.
Richard Thomson, I almost don't want to ask you this question because you don't have any peers, do you, under the SNP? But I'm sure you have an opinion on this. I suppose, to play devil's advocate, you could argue, well, it actually does what it says on the tin. It is a revising chamber, and they actually did quite a good job. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, it's definitely broke, but the fact that it occasionally gets to the right outcomes, I don't think changes the fundamental flaws that are there. I mean, even as the proverb goes, even a stopped clock gets it right twice a day. And I think that if the House of Lords is sometimes the voice of reason in the Houses of Parliament, that probably says more about the House of Commons than it does any inherent virtue in the House of Lords. But you're absolutely right, Ian. The Scottish National Party doesn't take any places in the House of Lords, despite being offered. But apart from the bit about binding together, because we believe it's a chamber that is discredited. It's based on it's based on, in part, on the hereditary principle. We still have the clergy represented, or the English clergy represented. And I think it's fine to want a revising chamber if you don't want a unicameral system, if you want a bicameral system. it's fine to have a revising chamber there, but you not only want the best people there, you want them to be as representative as possible of the country at large. And I don't think with the best will in the world you could say that. And certainly when you look at 22 of the Tories' largest donors finding themselves what a surprise, they eventually find themselves in the House of Lords, it completely sullies and contaminates the role that it plays. So I think it's time to do away with it. And I agree with every single word that Sebastian said about it, pretty much, apart from the bit about binding the union together. As you'd expect, I have a slightly different take on that.
Well, we did have someone in the last hour who thought that China invading Taiwan was analogous to Boris Johnson denying Scotland another referendum, which I must admit I thought slightly stretched credulity, but it was entertaining. Samantha, House of Lords reform, and what about this alleged link between donations and peerages?
I disagree with Sebastian and with the honourable member.
Richard is his name.
Yeah. I believe that although the House of Lords is it's a chamber of history, it isn't necessarily a place that is seen to have a position in the modern world. It's unelected, it is undemocratic by many means, and there are 772 Lords currently sitting in the House, which, in my opinion, is excessive and unnecessary. Reform does need to happen, but that doesn't mean that the Lords has no place in modern society. It doesn't mean that it cannot operate as a revisionary chamber, as a house of experts, so to speak, and its scrutinising role in holding the government to account, in holding Parliament to account, and in ensuring that as an unelected chamber who is not seeking re-election, who is not burdened by party political policies, by party political motivations.
Well, most of them are. They are allied to a party. I mean, there are crossbenchers, but most of them are from the main parties.
Yes, but I would also argue that the House of Lords has an entirely different role to Parliament, and to make it a democratically elected chamber would simply replicate many of the problems that exist in the Commons right now. And in allowing the Lords to continue to have a presence as a revisionary chamber in revising laws and in making sure that those policies that are being passed are not only well thought through, but are considered to be useful to the wider populace, the Lords can still play some sort of role.
Is it really possible, though, in 2021 to defend an appointed chamber?
I believe so. I think we have boards of directors, we have unelected bureaucrats in all positions in society, not just in the Lords. We have in, for example, Student Finance England, we have unelected bureaucrats that are ruling over the decisions that affect students.
Their head is a Tory peer, a friend of Boris Johnson's, James, what's his name?
James Wharton.
James Wharton, you're right.
In Public Health England, in plenty of other sectors, there are unelected officials who oversee the operations of companies and of organisations, of charities. To do away with the House of Lords simply because it's an unelected chamber would create problems in all other sectors of society.
Okay. I think that you probably lay awake at night thinking about these things.
No, I must admit it's not top of my list, Ian. But I mean, I have actually given evidence to the House of Lords quite recently, and there is an interesting process by which a chamber scrutinising an industry or getting into the detail of it in a non-political sense is interesting. I think how you appoint those people is absolutely key, and appointing them on a non-merit basis feels wrong, personally. And we talked about board members of different organisations. You have to apply to be a board member, and you have to go through a competition, essentially, to get appointed. So it's not as straightforward. You don't just get given it by somebody who says, oh, you're my mate and I'll give you a role. So I think taking that view, taking a step back, understanding what's good about it and trying to maintain that, but then looking at how do you get that representation working properly is really important.
David, thank you very much for your question. You can, of course, text your question in 84850. Shelley in Hartlepool has done just that. Her question is this: how many times are we going to be asked to take booster jabs? Does your panel think this is something I'm going to have to get used to doing for the rest of my life? Well, you don't say how old you are, Shelley, but I suspect it's going to happen for the next good few years. Richard Thomson for the SNP.
Simple answer is I don't know, but I suspect that if there is a trailing off in the effectiveness of vaccines and boosters over time, then yes, we probably are going to need top-ups of vaccine unless there's a mutation in the virus that makes it less dangerous to us, or it changes in some other way. I mean, I think that the announcement today is very important. I'll declare an interest being between the ages of 40 and 50. I'll be rolling.
Never.
Yeah,
I had you down for 32.
Oh, you're very kind. You're very kind. But I'll be rolling up my sleeve again for that one. And yes, I think that. The new normal is not the old normal, and this may well just be something that we have to get used to, as I say, until such time as the vaccine the virus either changes its form and becomes less dangerous, or we develop a natural immunity to it.
Can I just ask you, it's not to do with this question, but I suppose it's allied. Scotland and Wales have introduced vaccine passports, and yet the infection rate, I think, in Scotland is higher than in England at the moment. Have they worked, do you think? And because obviously Boris Johnson might have to make a decision on whether to follow suit at some point. What's been the Scotland experience?
I think it's maybe too early to say what effect it's having, but certainly I think there is a strong push factor from having vaccine passports to getting younger people vaccinated, because you're needing them to get into a lot of the venues that younger people would want to get into. So that's provided a motivating factor in a group that has had a lower take. Every cohort, that as you go down the age cohorts, seems to have had a lower take-up than their elders. But what I would say is I was in Estonia a couple of weekends ago, and even to get into a McDonald's, I needed to show a vaccine passport. It's commonplace right across Europe. They're talking about introducing one, I see, in Northern Ireland as well. The Health Minister, Robin Swan, was talking about that earlier today. And I think that anything that gives us an extra few percentage points of leverage against the impact that the virus has is a good thing to do. And it's there on your phone like any other app. It's hardly the monstrous inhibition of your civil liberties that some might have it.
The major takeaway, if you forgive the pun of that question, is that you were in Estonia and you went to a McDonald's.
My flight got in very, very late. My choices were extremely limited.
Samantha.
I think that Richard is very right. We simply don't know what is going to happen. But in my opinion, no government should have power over people's right to medical autonomy. We stayed at home, we protected the NHS, and we did all we could to save lives. I'm not anti-vax. I've had both of my vaccines. I look forward to getting my booster jab. But it should be everyone's right to choose what they put into their body, whether or not it's medically or scientifically positive for them. And freedom should not be contingent on health status. Under no circumstances should any government be able to mandate vaccines for any sector, whether it's health workers, teachers, young people, over 5s, over 80s. No one should have to have their domestic freedoms curtailed for the purpose of the greater good or public health. At the end of the day, it is our right to choose what we put into our bodies. And while I'm happy to have the booster jab, others aren't. And I perfectly understand that that's their right to. And the government, for example, in Austria...
Well, nobody's suggesting it should be mandatory.
Well, in Austria, they've recently imposed a lockdown for all of those who aren't vaccinated. Is that suggesting that it isn't mandatory? Because while it may not be mandatory in law, all of the freedoms
it's a pretty strong encouragement for people to get vaccinated. I don't see any problem with that at all.
It's more of
if you choose not to be vaccinated, suffer the consequences.
It's more than an encouragement, though. It's enforcement.
Good.
Like I said, I'm pro-vaccine. I think that anyone who wishes to have a vaccine should be able to access it. But I also think that anyone who does not wish to have a vaccine should not have their domestic freedoms curtailed. It's the simple principle of medical autonomy.
If you make a choice, then you have to live with the consequences of that choice. And if you deliberately do something to make yourself more infectious and yourself more liable to be infected, then I think a government has the right to say, well, you can make that choice, but there will be consequences for that, and the consequences will be possibly that you will be locked down where other people won't be. I don't see any problem with that.
On that thread, though, Iain, would you not say that then the government should mandate all vaccines, vaccines for MMR, vaccines for the flu, vaccines for any sort of illness that is infectious that can be spread to other people? Where do we stop? Where do we draw the line?
There are things that are mandatory. For example, doctors have to have the hepatitis B jab, don't they? Otherwise they can't practice.
But should the whole population then have the hepatitis B jab or fear not being able to leave their houses, not being able to access employment, not being able to go to education, for example? Some universities are saying that those who...
population in the same way that COVID does.
Was measles not one of the most deadly illnesses of the 20 and 21st century? But did they ever mandate vaccines to achieve that? No. The vaccine uptake in the United Kingdom has been historically high. It's
I'm
people
sorry,
are willing
but
to take the
you're
vaccine.
giving the
There's no
impression that
need
the government
to-
is trying to mandate the vaccine or the booster jab. All they've said on that is that for people in the healthcare sector, that would be mandatory. For the rest of the population, everybody's got
Shelley
the
was
perfect
asking
right
whether
to do
this was
that.
something that she should have to get used to taking for the rest of her life. And if the government is going to continue to push vaccines to save Christmas, to save Easter, to save your family, to save your gran, it is going to become something that she's going to have to get used to, or fear, like you said, the consequences of choosing medical autonomy.
We'll come to Juliet and Sebastian in just a moment. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
20 past 8 on LBC, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. Let me tell you who they are in case you've just joined us. Richard Thomson is the SNP MP for Gordon. Juliet Davenport is founder of GoodEnergy. Just tell us a little bit about GoodEnergy.
GoodEnergy is a
That's what it
renewable
says on
energy
the tin.
company. Yeah, it's great energy. Fantastic. It's all green and blue, beautiful and of the future.
Well, you're certainly an enthusiast for it.
Wow, you've got to be here.
Yeah, you absolutely have. Seb Payne is a Whitehall editor for the Financial Times, and Samantha Smith is a Conservative activist. Right, we are just in the middle of answering this question from Shelley in Hartlepool. How many times are we going to be asked to take booster jabs? Does your panel think this is something I'm going to have to get used to doing for the rest of my life? Juliet.
Well, I think we see a lot of booster jabs for lots of things. So flu, we're all asked to have a booster jab for flu, whether you're kids, whether you're over 50 now, we get pushed out in there. It kind of makes you feel old, generally, when they ask you for a booster jab. It's like, you're past it, and at that point in your life where you need
Speak
booster
for
jabs.
yourself.
Well, maybe just me then. So I think we are going to have to get used to it until we see this disease change and become either under control, not creating. I mean, it's a huge economic cost. Whether it's from the NHS or whether from the overall economy. So my view is we should do everything we can to keep it at bay and move it forward so that we can actually recover as an economy and be able to cope with it going forwards.
So,
I think COVID is going to be with us forever. That this idea that you can get to zero COVID has been absolutely destroyed over the past couple of months, and it is going to be endemic for the world forevermore. So the question is, how do we live and manage it? And I think the UK has actually struck a pretty good balance, that COVID cases are coming down, and Boris Johnson's decision to get us out of those restrictions early was widely criticised at the time, but seems to have paid off, that it was sort of letting the handbrake off the car. We've gained up momentum, and we seem to be in a pretty okay place for the winter. The reason these jabs are needed is clearly because of the fact that the immunity is waning much quicker than we'd hope it would be. So I think we'll get to a point when they're going to be every 6 months and then to every year, and much like the flu, and the jabs will develop, they will get better. But the key thing we've still got to focus on are those who are not getting the jabs. That out of those top categories, there's still about 8% of the population, I think, who've still not had their first and second jabs. And those are the people who are most vulnerable to getting coronavirus, going into hospital, and tracking those down is very, very difficult indeed. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the boosters without thinking about the rest of the population. There's still, particularly in some younger categories and very elderly categories, the government's got to get to. To pick up on a point that Samantha was mentioning earlier about coercion and this debate about who and what should take vaccine jabs. Look, my general view on this is we've been very lucky and our government's done the right thing of pushing and nudging people in the right direction. But you do get to a point when you need to go beyond that. And I think care homes, hospitals, those are clear places where if people are not taking jabs, then they don't have a place there, because we looked at the care home disaster that's happened time and time again across the world. So in those instances, I don't have a problem with coercion. The fact is, if we're facing some kind of coercion versus lockdown, then I think most people would kind of just feel it's better to do everything we can, even if it's draconian sometimes, to avoid shutting down our society, locking up the economy, and creating even more health issues in the future.
Right, let's move on to Harry in Bury St Edmunds. Hello, Harry.
Good evening, Ian. I hope you're well.
Very well. What would you like to ask?
Good. My question is really aimed at the future of the country, really. Young people like Samantha and myself are at university. I know a lot of people are rather concerned with what's developing with China and Russia at the moment. Should the country not be looking more towards increasing its mutually assured destruction capability and ensuring that our future is safeguarded against the potential risk that China has by declaring war on Taiwan, or Russia with Ukraine, and just ensuring that our future is just as secure and safe as those before us?
You mean increased defence spending?
Increased defence spending and making sure that the Trident submarines are always on service and ready in case such a scenario occurs.
Richard Thomson.
No, in short. I've always been opposed to nuclear weapons anywhere, but I've always felt that the UK's nuclear deterrent was only ever really riding on the coattails and support of the technical support it gets from the United States. And I've always felt that if you wanted to review defence from a UK posture, it would be far better to have a more strong conventional set of forces than it is to have the doomsday weapon that is nuclear. Because
how would increasing the size of the army be a deterrent to China, for example?
Well, it depends. It's hard to see how Trident is a deterrent from most of the threats that we're currently facing. I mean, most of the threats we're currently facing are asymmetrical threats, whether it's cyber attack, whether it's misinformation, whether it's salami slice encroaching in Europe, as we see from Russia. And I just find it very, very difficult to envisage the circumstances where the answer is to send the message to the bunker at Northolt and then launch the missiles at any part of the world. And I just do not see that it's a good use of our resources. It's a horrendously expensive commitment, and it doesn't give you the capabilities that you need to counter those smaller scale aggressions that are being built up to, because there's no way any Chinese leader or Russian leader is going to be threatening the UK with nuclear weapons. It's threats that
they might if we didn't have them.
I very much doubt that. They're not interested in provoking a hot confrontation.
I'd rather eliminate any doubt at all.
I don't think it eliminates anything at all. I think they're not interested in a hot confrontation, but they are interested in using other strengths in areas where we are weak, and we're weak in areas of conventional defence, and in tackling some of those asymmetrical threats, like particularly vulnerable to sort of disinformation campaigns that destabilise our politics.
Juliet.
So I think, I mean, it's interesting because obviously the US and the UK have done a deal with Australia to support sort of submarines, nuclear submarines in the Pacific. And I think we're kind of seeing these movements around, there's kind of general shifting around, trying to look after a potential threat coming out of China. But in terms of, I'm slightly more on the side of looking at where I think the bigger threats, immediate threats that are really going to be pushed are going to be around cyber. And cyber is a massive threat. So understanding whether Chinese technology is implemented in our nuclear power stations, whether it's implemented in our telecom systems, actually for me, those are bigger threats that we should be thinking through in terms of actually who controls the systems in our economy. And those, although nuclear is always there in the background, those are going to be things that affect us day in, day out. And I think we should be focusing on that as much as anything else.
And that's a really interesting one because, of course, China and Russia are the two main cyber threats to us, and North Korea as well, it has to be said. And in cyber terms, it's much easier to hit back. And we apparently do hit back through GCHQ. I mean, we don't really read a lot about this, but if we're attacked on the cyber front, apparently we hit back, and a good thing too, I think. Samantha?
I think that the biggest thing that needs to come from the Western world when it comes to China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine is a consistent approach between the US and Europe. We need the same firmness from, say, Germany, the SDP, who are set to lead Germany's coalition, as we have seen from Paris, as we see from the UK with its Trident programme. We need a package of deterrent steps. We need financial sanctions. We need the promise of defence from Europe, from the UN and from the US to Ukraine if Russia continues.
You mean NATO, not the UN.
NATO. If the Kremlin continues to ramp up its defence, if they continue to amass more troops, they already have 100,000 on the border. We need to see not just nuclear spending, not just building up our defences, because that should never be our first resort. It should be our last resort. We should see deterrent steps. We should see a package of demands to Russia, same with China. And it's a little bit harder with China because China is obviously the leading force in the modern world now. Its rise in the 21st century has been meteoric and very concerning when you look at what's going on with the Uyghur Muslims. If you look at what's going on in Taiwan, it's much harder to police what goes on in China and how they approach their population, their democracy, to put it loosely. But when it comes to Russia, we need to demonstrate to the Kremlin that further action from them is unexcusable and would have a devastating consequence to them.
Sebastian Payne.
Well, on the Trident question, first of all, it is actually expanding already at the moment, that in the integrated review, we're increasing the missile stock for the first time. It was due to go down to 180 and is now going to go up to 260. And we have got Trident now until the 2060s that the vote passed Parliament. That is going to be there. And the reason the warhead count was increased in the integrated review was due to that threat from China and Russia, and the idea that you have to maintain, at least for the mutually assured destruction doctrine that the listener talked about there, that remains in place. You've got to be a credible threat for that to have any purpose. I agree with what a lot has been said on the panel, that we have to be very aware of the economic and cyber element here, because that's increasingly where warfare is going to be. But I am very worried about cuts that have happened to the armed services as well, because when you look at what's happened in Ukraine and on the border over the last couple of days, the UK doesn't really have a credible ability to put a military presence on the ground there, because we've cut the army back several times. We can't fill our own troop targets there that were set. People don't want to join the army. They don't see it as a compelling thing. And again, this is all about, when you look at these bigger actors who are far more powerful, far bigger military than the UK have, how can we appear to be a country they have to take seriously previously, and obviously NATO is a big part of that. Being part of the UN Security Council is part of that, and that all comes back down to having our Trident nuclear system.
Richard, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, just very briefly, Ian, thank you. Do we not think that there's a contradiction, to put it mildly, between having a government that talks tough about Russian aggression but still rolls out the red carpet for Russian investors to buy up London and invest in the financial markets in the city? And also, do we think that support for a nuclear deterrent would be quite so strong across the UK if instead of being based 30 miles from the centre of Glasgow, the Trident submarines were based 30 miles from the centre of London, perhaps somewhere like Tilbury?
Well, we have nuclear power stations quite near London.
They don't go bang quite the same way.
Well, they could do. Very quickly, Seb.
Just to come back on both of those points, I think if Scotland left the UK, Trident would move to Barrow or to the West Country, and I'm sure they'd be very happy for the 8,000 jobs that Trident currently supports.
It supports 500.
It supports a lot more than that. The whole UK's industry, I'm pretty sure it does.
At Faslane, it's 500 jobs directly related to Trident.
But there's the whole supply chain network as well, which is more than 500 jobs.
Right. Well, I can tell you that our next question is going to be one that Juliet does think about most days, I imagine. Mind boggles, doesn't it? 8:32 on LBC. Dominic Ellis has the news headlines.
Police have named the man believed to be behind the taxi explosion outside Liverpool Women's Hospital. 32-year-old Emad Al-Sweilman died in the blast yesterday morning, which has been declared as a terrorist incident. The UK's terror threat level has since been raised to severe. The government says coronavirus booster jabs will be added to the NHS COVID pass. The Prime Minister has suggested people who haven't had one might not be classed as fully vaccinated in the future. And 3 members of a gang who stole £26 million worth of cash and jewellery from celebrity homes have been jailed. The Italian nationals admitted planning what's been described as Britain's biggest ever burglary spree. And the weather, the odd spot of rain in places tonight, heavier in the far north during the early hours, a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
With us on LBC on Cross Question are Richard Thomson, the SNP MP for Gordon, Juliet Davenport, founder of GoodEnergy, Seb Payne, FT Whitehall editor, who also has a book out. You thought I wasn't going to mention it, didn't you? What's it about?
Thank you very much, Ian. It's Broken Heartlands, a journey through Labour's lost England, and it's a 10-seat road trip through all those parts of England that voted Tory for the first time, and it tries to figure out, is Boris Johnson going to hold on to it, or is he going to lose it back to Labour at the next election?
And if you'd like to hear Sebastian and me talking about his book for an hour, you can do so on the Iain Dale Book Club podcast. It was about 2 months ago, wasn't it? So you don't have to scroll back too far.
It was very enjoyable, actually, and you caught me off guard because we talked a lot about the book, and then you delved into lots of great questions about my life and times in the past.
What I try to do. But what I do know is that podcast sold you a lot of books, according to Twitter. People kept saying, I listened to your podcast and bought that book.
I'm always grateful to you, Ian.
Indeed. Now, Samantha, you haven't written a book yet, have you? What would you like to write about if you did write a book?
It might seem a little bit off left field, but I'd really like to write a book about netball. I'm a big netballer.
Let's the most pointless sport ever invented.
Excuse me, squash.
No, squash is great sport if you're under 35. If you're over 35, anyway.
I'd love to see you on the squash court, Ian.
Believe me, not at the age of 50.
That should be your next book club
At the age of 32, you might have done. Not at the age of 59, I can assure you.
We can get you into a netball dress if you'd like.
Mike's in Beverley. Hello, Mike. Come to my rescue, please.
Hi, Ian.
What's your question?
My question for the panel is, would the panel agree that the final COP26 declaration is what we would describe in Yorkshire as better than nout?
Juliet Davenport, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So I think I would agree with the Yorkshire comments. Better than now. It's definitely... We got something out of it. We got agreements from more countries than ever to make commitments. 1.5 is still in sight, so all those low-lying islands could still exist. We got coal is on its way out with a few little blips around China and India. And there's a rule book.
Quite big blips, to be fair.
Oh, they were quite big blips. But it still moved in the right direction. We didn't lose the Polish. We didn't lose the Vietnamese. We didn't lose a lot of some of those other countries who have made big commitments. And I think one of the things that's slightly underrepresented is actually the rule books there. The British are very good at rule books. We're good at reporting. We're good at ticking our own work. And that is there. And that's going to be really important because it's all very well making all these commitments. But if nobody's going to check that we've done anything about them and then look at the data and make sure it all comes through, there's no point. And that is beginning to be established as part of this COP. And I think that's a really important step.
Were you there?
I was there for a brief period, yes. It was interesting, I have to say. It was. I might have organised it slightly differently, personally. There were bits of it that were very quiet, almost desolate, and there were bits that were very busy. And I think you could have done a bit.
That was the bars.
Well, the bus, it was actually...
And the airports with the private jets.
I didn't go, I went by train, so I didn't see the airport.
I assumed that. I wasn't going to be so pertinent as to ask.
I tell you what I did get, what I really enjoyed actually in Glasgow is you can rent a bike in Glasgow and bike round, and that was the best way to get around, because otherwise, between the demonstrations and the fact that half the road seemed to be closed off, getting anybody where was really difficult.
Seb, did you go?
And very sadly, I didn't. And someone who was there described it to me as party conferences without the bars and socialising, which does not sound like the most enjoyable endeavour.
There were some bars.
I think Richard will confirm there are bars in Glasgow.
Yeah. Oh, there's definitely bars.
I think with inside the secure zone, the facilities may have been somewhat more limited. I'd completely agree with the call. I think better than nout is a great way of describing it. That obviously very lofty expectations were set by the Prime Minister for this conference. They were going to be almost impossible to meet. But I think there's two things that are worth noting. First of all, the final Glasgow declaration included a reference to coal. And obviously it was drive down as opposed to drive out coal. And even though Boris Johnson tried to say there's no difference between those things, there clearly is. The fact coal was in there and the fact that China and India signed up to that was a big deal because that's the first time they've got in there binding commitments on that. The second is that the money put forward was pretty much what was required and what was needed, not necessarily on the time frame that the UK would have liked, liked, but everyone has put the cash forward. And I think, as you were just saying, Juliet, the fact that we've still got 1.5 in sight is a very good thing, because it would have been so easy for that to slip away entirely, and that would have mean, death and desolation for thousands of people across the world if we hadn't done that. So it is good, and I think it was Boris Johnson said it was above 6 out of 10 how he'd rated. I think I would go for a kind of 7 out of 10 at this point, but crucially it is about delivery, because Alok Sharma is president for COP for the rest of this year until COP27 it meets in Egypt, and really the thing is going to be delivering on that, because these broad agreements are fine, but the detailed policy is the really difficult stuff, and holding people to those commitments, because these conferences take place in this very generic globalese language that means absolutely nothing to the average ordinary person about their lives, and it's down to national leaders to try and bridge that divide.
That's a very interesting point you make. I was interviewing John Gummer, or Lord Deben as we now call him, or the artist formerly known as John Gummer, and he said yesterday that I haven't got the faintest idea what a kilowatt hour is, and nor of most normal people. I'm thinking, mate, you're the chairman of the House of Lords committee on this. Surely you should actually understand what that kind of thing is. Samantha?
I totally agree with the Yorkshire phrase of better than nought, although my southern accent probably slaughtered it. I believe that the UK has done a fantastic job in leading the way in global climate change commitments, but other nations are still falling short. We've seen Algeria, Iran, India, China not making their commitments clear, or in India's case, refusing to bring their commitments officially forward to the UN. India saying that they will phase out, I believe, coal by 2050 is frankly just not good enough. And while the UK, like I said, is leading the way, it isn't our sole responsibility to meet the commitments that the global stage requires. In order to keep some of these low-lying islands that you were speaking about, we need to stick to 1.5. We need to make the changes in industry, in our economy, in future-thinking solutions to energy, renewable sources, to ensure that in the future, not just Western affluent countries like the UK, the US, Germany, France, but other developing nations such as Africa, Southeast Asia can also bring their climate change commitments forward and can achieve them realistically, given their
Are you
economic...
not being slightly unfair on India, because they did make a commitment to net zero by 2070? Now, I know that's way ahead of most other countries, but at least they made a commitment for the first time. And there were one or two other things where they did move. Now, in the end, they didn't want to agree to the changes on coal. That's absolutely right. But shouldn't we welcome the fact that countries like India are at least moving in the right direction now, which they weren't before?
Yes, it is better than nought, as Mike said, but it isn't good enough in my opinion.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an outbreak of consensus here. I agree with practically everything that's been said by the other guests here. It is better than nought. It's obviously not what everyone would have hoped for, but nevertheless I think there's a governance framework there. There's some fairly significant commitments in there. There's a broad agreement on what is causing climate change and how it needs to be tackled, even if the commitments aren't at the scale from all countries and all countries that have a major impact, even if that commitment isn't at the scale that we would like. But we've agreed that coal is bad and needs to be phased out. It cannot continue unabated. We've agreed on the need to forestry has a major role to play, that we should stop deforestation. And I think that the challenge now that that is in place and some steps are being taken, be they ever so tentative, is to use the months and the years ahead to try and upgrade that commitment from other countries which are having the big impact there. But I think also particularly we're in a difficult position in the Western world to tell other countries in the world that they aspire to the same standards of living that we've had, that they can't have that. And I think there is with our technological advantages and our advantages from entrenched advantage in research and development, let's help countries to industrialise better in a way that doesn't have the same impact as we ourselves have had through our industrialisation. I'll take it back to Scotland, as you'd expect. Scotland was one of the first parts of the world to industrialise as it did. I think there's a particular responsibility to set an example there, and it's not necessarily about the examples of your power in this, but the power of your example. So I think let's show a better way for the countries that haven't gone as far down the road as we would like, so that we can take them down the road faster in the months and years ahead.
Mike, thank you very much for that question. In the next couple of minutes, we'll stop Sebastian Payne from expiring. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. It's 8:46.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Paul Keir with Sir Keir Starmer.
Graham in Rugby.
Your views, please, on second jobs.
I strongly believe that paid consultancies and directorships should just be outlawed, and we've been arguing for that for quite a long time. We're going to put to Parliament a vote which is going to ask MPs to vote to get rid of paid directorships and paid consultancies and change the rules in Parliament.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. You're Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Richard Thomson, Juliet Davenport, Sebastian Payne and Samantha Smith with me answering your questions. Let's take a text question from Val in Bramley. Reports are saying they're going to scrap the HS2 Leeds branch. Isn't it time to finally scrap the silly thing altogether? Juliet.
I thought you might come to me first. I mean, it's such a shame because it's such a contentious project, yet we should be absolutely looking for better travel, better rail travel. I came back from Glasgow on the train. It wasn't
second time she said that.
It wasn't a great experience, it has to be said. I think there might have been a sandwich on the train on a 5-hour journey. So I think definitely upgrading our capability to travel by train, to get across the country, not having to get on a plane. But it doesn't feel like this project is really giving us the poster child that we should really be having for this industry. And I think there are so many contentious issues around where is it going, what environmental degradation it's creating is it the best route to be putting in the UK? Should we scrap it altogether? I think we should take a very good look at it before we commit any further.
But we did take a good look at it a couple of years ago, didn't we? And the government announced last year that they were going to continue. But of course, that was before the pandemic, before any of us had heard the word Zoom.
Yes, exactly. And my question, I guess, my understanding was that it was about increasing speed, particularly, and on particular routes. But shouldn't we be thinking about actually how are we getting across the country altogether? And is this what we really need going
case for HS2 was more about capacity on the West Coast Main Line and also business travel. Now, I would say, Sebastian Payne, that case has been blown out of the water now because of the pandemic, and that the business travel aspect of it. I mean, are people going to travel to Birmingham as much as they used to see each other face to face, or will they be doing it on video conferencing?
Well, if you've tried to get a train up the West Coast Main Line to Birmingham in the past couple of weeks, I think that might answer the question for you, that the trains are pretty much back to where they were capacity they were before the pandemic. They're a lot busier than they were. And I think to go to the point that Juliet was making, HS2 is totally necessary because the West Coast Main Line was built in the Victorian eras. It can't travel very fast. There are many bends and curves, which means you can't run faster trains on it. You can't run longer trains on it. And Network Rail have done several major studies into what could you do instead. Could you expand the platforms? Could you have different trains? And every single one costs more and delivered less benefits than HS2 did.
What about this spur to Leeds? Because that's what they're going to announce on Thursday, I believe. They're going to abandon that and put more money into localised rail services in the north.
So the good news is they're not abandoning it entirely. 42 miles of it, as we report in tomorrow's FT, is going to still be built. So if you want to go to the East Midlands Parkway, you're in luck.
I love going to the East Midlands Parkway.
But if you want to go to Leeds, it's a lovely parkway in the East Midlands. And if you want to go to Leeds, then you're in not such good luck. Getting rid of this eastern leg is a diabolical decision because so much of the original business case was about connecting the east to the west, Birmingham and the rest of the country. Now, the fact is, these other elements they're putting money into, that's a good thing. But why can't we do both? Why does it have to be this either or?
Spend, Sebastian Payne. You work for the FT. You should believe in financial rectitude.
Well, first of all, a lot of this money is raised by the private sector. And second of all, if you look at transport infrastructure in these places, over the past century, in every single metric, they've had lower investment than London and the South East. So I think if now you're trying to compensate for that, how on earth is that a bad thing? And how on earth do you improve the skills, the productivity, and getting business investment into these places when the infrastructure is so poor?
Can I advise you not to read my Telegraph column tomorrow, because I said exactly the opposite.
Wouldn't want us to fall out, Ian.
Samantha.
You know, I'm in almost complete agreement with Sebastian on this here. First off, I think, frankly, it's too late to turn back now. Scrapping the whole of HS2 would cost us more money than we've already put into it and would have absolutely no benefits besides risking not spending more money on HS2, which I suppose for some people would be the ideal outcome. But at the moment, I'm studying in Durham. I'm right in the heart of the north at Durham University, and it took me, to get back. Is
it not term time now? How come you're here?
I have special permission, and I do not have any lectures today. So don't get me in trouble with my university this early on, please, Ian.
They're not listening or watching, I'm sure.
But it took me 7.5 hours to get home to Durham from London the other week, simply because the number of diversions, the number of cancellations, the number of issues that we had on the existing lines, as Sebastian said, footfall on trains, on public transport, is pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels. I can attest to that sitting in the footwell of of the entrance of a train to make sure that I had a space, because the number of people on that train was just so immense because of all of the cancellations and other issues. I think that any opportunity to provide better connections to the north, to the Midlands, my home in Telford, I love it, I adore it, I want to get back to it as soon as possible.
Has anyone ever said that before, that they want to get back to Telford as soon as possible?
Well, let me be the first. I'm always defending Telford. I think that I agree that cancelling the Leeds portion of HS2 is a diabolical decision. I think that it's a betrayal of levelling up, as many publications are going to say tomorrow. But we need to focus on the positives that are happening. So the East Midlands Parkway is still happening. The links to Birmingham are still happening. I'm also going to be fighting for the East Midlands Parkway now. I know nothing about it, but it's becoming my new pet project.
Richard, eventually HS2 is supposed to become HS3 and go all the way up to Glasgow or possibly even Edinburgh as well. What in about 2048 or something like that. Yeah. Looking at this Leeds spur at the moment, if they do announce that they're going to either abolish or suspend it, what's your view on that?
Well, obviously that's not good news for Yorkshire or the East Midlands, but allow me to look at it from a different point of view. We're in a very difficult place if our computers go zoom, but our trains don't. And we're well behind the rest of Europe.
You've used that line before, haven't you?
I haven't, actually.
No, just very good, very good. Exclusive for LBC.
So the more miles we get on this that are going from north to south, the better. Now, I'm very, very tempted to describe the splitting of the line north of Birmingham as the two fingers up to Scotland, because it's going either side of the Pennines. And that creates problems for the Scottish Government, because the Scottish Government is desperate, has got it in the strategic infrastructure plan to introduce high-speed rail. But how do you build that line? Because if it's going to go up the east coast through Newcastle from London, you'd go from Glasgow to Edinburgh and Newcastle. If, on the other hand, it goes up the west coast, you would do pretty much something along the existing route of the West Coast Main Line in Scotland, where Glasgow and Edinburgh meet up somewhere round about Carstairs Junction and then head down to Carlisle. But if you want to make a real environmental and business impact here, what you're really looking for is to get people off of domestic flight. Now, nobody's really flying that much from Leeds to London, but an awful lot of people fly between Edinburgh and Glasgow and London. And if you can get that existing 4.5 hours on a good day train journey down to about 2.5 hours, that's a complete game changer.
Yeah, it really is.
I come down from, my closest railway station is where I live is Aberdeen. It's 7.5 hours down the east coast. There's just absolutely no way I'm going to do that to come down to Parliament. So I often come down overnight on the sleeper, which is great. But if you had a high-speed line that was going all the way from London up to Scotland, that would be a game changer for a lot of people as well. And I think if it started at Edinburgh and Glasgow, or better still Aberdeen and gone south, you'd have had that high-speed spine connecting up a hell of a lot faster than you were starting in London. Because, of course, the most expensive bit is going to be digging out a tunnel between Euston and Old Oak Common. That's the single most expensive piece of the line. And the place, of course, where you can have the greatest impact is going between, the Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Warrington, and through that tricky terrain in the Lake District. That's where the money should have been spent. So I don't want to deprive the East Midlands of what it's missing out on. I think people are right to be angry. But, if you were really doing this properly, you'd have started north and gone south.
I think I ought to ring the Telegraph news desk and say, can you put something else in place in my column tomorrow now? Anyway, Michelle is a fan of Sebastian. She says, Sebastian Payne is lost on Iain Dale's show. Too much intellect, knowledge and reason. Get her. Right. Elias in Kennington has our final text question. The English National Opera is working on a new production based on the Netflix show Tiger King. I think it's time for some operas about the lives of politicians. Who should be the first subject? I'll give a starter for 10. Alex Salmond, Richard Thomson.
I would pay to see that, but I think you could do a very, very good one about Boris Johnson as well.
Juliet?
I think I'd go for Tony Blair. I think there's a lot of operatics in there, a lot of drama.
A lot of hamming it up.
Yes, that's my point.
Samantha?
I'm a conservative through and through, but I have so much time for Clement Attlee, and I'd love to see a story about the government that created the welfare state, including the NHS. Clement
Attlee in an opera. Said no one ever. Sebastian?
Well, I'm tempted to say The Last Temptation of Matthew Hancock would be an opera I'd love to see. But
don't say that, he'll put it in the book.
But I think, given events of recent weeks and his wonderful baritone, I think the Geoffrey Cox Mauritius Odyssey with that wonderful baritone voice.
He could play himself.
He could. He would charge his fair sum for it as well.
He'd make an excellent Mr. Bumble anyway.
Well, thank you all very much for your contributions this evening. It's Richard Thomson, Juliet Davenport, Samantha Smith and Sebastian Payne. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about, believe it or not, the Elgin Marbles. Should we return the Elgin Marbles to Greece? Because the Greek Prime Minister is trying to broker a deal, but Boris Johnson is having none of it. 0345 6060 973. Particularly keen to hear from you if you are of Greek origin. Why are the Elgin Marbles so important to Greece? You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, police have known the man believed to be behind the taxi explosion outside Liverpool Women's Hospital. 32-year-old Emad Al-Sweilman died